Key takeaways from Florida talks ahead of Witkoff's trip to Putin. We'll talk about this with David Tefuri, international lawyer and former State Department official. David, glad to see you, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me again.
David, in Miami, Florida, the negotiations between the Ukrainian and U.S. delegations on a peaceful resolution of the war have concluded. The discussions between American and Ukrainian officials lasted approximately 4 hours. In your view, what are the potential implications of these negotiations, even without insider knowledge? How would you evaluate the impact of international support on Ukrainians' negotiating position?
Well, this was a great opportunity for the Ukrainian delegation to have more time to explain to Secretary Rubio and the other U.S. officials why the 28-point plan, as originally conceived, did not meet the aspirations of the Ukrainian people and would not work functionally as a ceasefire agreement going forward. And this, to set the table, this happened during the holiday weekend, our Thanksgiving holiday here in the United States. These U.S. officials taking time away from the holiday, but also it's a holiday about the independence of our country, about freedom, and thanking the world for our freedom here. And so it was an appropriate time to be talking about how do we ensure that Ukraine will be a free country going forward. And I'm sure that message was not lost on those who participated in these negotiations. And my guess is that the U.S. side left with a better understanding of the Ukrainian side and what compromises are necessary from the Kremlin in order to have a chance of having a deal that both sides would agree to.
David, Ukraine seeks to arrange a personal meeting between Zelensky and Trump. A source told RBC Ukraine that interlocutor noted that Kyiv is aiming not merely for a formal encounter to sign agreements. The Ukrainian president wants to discuss a range of key issues directly with his American counterpart. However, it appears that Trump has no intention of doing so. From your perspective, what strategic importance would a direct meeting between President Zelensky and President Trump have for Ukraine?
Well, every time that President Zelensky and President Trump have spoken after the February Oval Office meeting, it's actually resulted in President Trump having a better understanding of the Ukrainian position. And President Zelensky is very charismatic and a very good advocate for Ukraine and for the Ukrainian side. So when he has a chance to talk to President Trump, whether by phone or in person, of course, it's even better in person, he usually succeeds in convincing President Trump to take a more pro-Ukraine position vis-a-vis Russia. So I think it's right for President Zelensky to be doing outreach to President Trump to pursue this one-on-one meeting with President Trump, and it will give him a chance to further solidify the points that were made in this Florida meeting about what is necessary for a peace agreement with the Kremlin.
Meanwhile, Donald Trump, commenting on the course of negotiations to end the Russia-Ukraine war, stated that Ukraine has some difficult problems, specifically the corruption situation, which does not help. How might President Trump's comments on Ukrainians' internal challenges, such as corruption, influence the current peace negotiations, in your opinion?
Well, this was a bad time for the corruption scandals to percolate in Ukraine, and obviously it's had a big impact on the Ukrainian government, including now the longtime chief of staff is no longer with the president. And so President Trump is just reacting to that news and probably to briefings he's received from his top aides about what's happening with respect to Ukraine. And it would be very important for Ukraine to demonstrate that it's taking on corruption head on. I think it has made a lot of progress over the last few years in reducing corruption, but given the situation that Ukraine is in, where it needs all of the resources and all the money possible to defend itself, it is shameful if anyone is stealing any of that money. And so I think that rings true with most Ukrainians and with most Ukrainian officials and with President Zelensky. And it's now about making the changes necessary to constrain government officials from engaging in corruption.
David, amid ongoing peace negotiations between the US and Ukraine, creative solutions are being explored that could allow Kyiv's red lines to be bypassed, including regarding NATO membership. Previously, one of the most problematic demands of the original US peace proposal was the formal requirement for Ukraine to renounce its NATO aspirations, which contradicts its constitution. The new scenario suggests a different approach. No one will force Ukraine, officially or legally, to give up this aspiration, a CNN source reported. What risks exist?
Well, I think there's also a risk to the US and to NATO. I mean, NATO becomes a less powerful and formative alliance if another country outside the NATO alliance, like Russia, can dictate who will be in the NATO alliance and who will not be in the NATO alliance. And that just sets a really bad precedent that NATO should never accept. The decision for a country to join NATO should be up to the current NATO alliance members and that country and nobody else. It's really nobody else's business. If Ukraine wants to join NATO, then it has a right to pursue that. And it will be up to the NATO powers to make a decision. There are a lot of reasons why it would be in the interests of NATO to have Ukraine join. Maybe there are some reasons not to have Ukraine join, at least while there's an ongoing conflict. So the best case scenario is to just push this question down the line for a later generation, perhaps, to decide, or at least till after the conflict with Russia is over, and then to make a decision based on what's best for both the NATO alliance and for Ukraine.
David, the talks between U.S. Special envoy Witkoff and Russian dictator Vladimir Putin will take place tomorrow evening, December 2nd, Putin's press secretary Dmitry Peskov said, as reported by TASS. What lessons from past negotiations between the US and Russia might be relevant here?
Well, hopefully Witkoff is going to take a greater understanding of the Ukrainian side into these meetings. He has notoriously left meetings with the Kremlin and with Putin with a very one-sided view of the conflict and what needs to be done to resolve the conflict. And hopefully now, he's been in this position as an envoy for almost a year, and he's been focused on the Ukraine-Russia war for a long time, and he has a better understanding of what is required. It is not productive for him to come back with just a wish list from Putin, which hasn't changed since February 2022 when Putin invaded Ukraine. It's going to be unacceptable to the Ukrainian side, and it's never going to be the basis for a peace agreement that will be lasting. And as soon as Witkoff recognizes that and delivers a harder message to Russia, including he should deliver in that message, there will be consequences if Russia does not make compromises. That would be the type of productive meeting that would make sense for Witkoff to travel all the way over to Moscow to meet Putin.
David, from a risk assessment perspective, what are the potential benefits of holding these talks?
Well, every time you have talks like this and you make sure that both sides' positions are represented, you hopefully make progress towards what could ultimately be a peace agreement. I still think we're pretty far away from having a peace agreement, but that's mostly because Putin and Russia have made no concessions whatsoever. And until they make those concessions, we're not going to have a peace agreement. But it still makes sense to talk. And the Trump administration puts a real premium on these types of negotiations, especially in-person negotiations. And so they are right to pursue them. And the U.S. does wield power very well under President Trump. And part of wielding power, though, is ensuring that Russia understands there will be further consequences if they're not reasonable in these negotiations. You can't just keep having talks forever and make no progress.
David, and Europe is demanding that Trump not exempt Russia from accountability for war crimes in Ukraine. European Commissioner for Justice and Democracy told Politico that negotiators must ensure that efforts to achieve a ceasefire do not result in Russia avoiding judicial prosecution. How significant is Europe's insistence on holding Russia accountable for war crimes in shaping the peace negotiation process?
Again, we have to be careful about setting precedents that we can't live with, and to give immunity to everyone who engaged in war crimes on the Russian side would be a really bad precedent, and it would actually incentivize war crime activity by future countries, knowing that once they got a peace agreement, they could potentially get immunity. So every soldier needs to understand they are bound by international law, they are bound by the Geneva Convention, and if they engage in war crimes, they can and should be prosecuted somewhere, whether it's in their own country or if their own country is unwilling to do that, then in an international court like the International Criminal Court. And that has to weigh heavy on every entity engaging in war, and to take away the possibility of prosecutions for war crimes against Russians where there is sufficient evidence to show they did engage in war crimes would be a huge mistake and set a very bad precedent for the global order.
Now we see that Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky arrived at the Elysee Palace, where he was greeted by French President Emmanuel Macron. What is the strategic significance of President Zelensky's visit to the Elysee Palace?
Also very important, President Zelensky has a very good relationship with Macron and with the other European leaders. They have a quite slightly different view than President Trump on what needs to be done in order to accomplish a peace agreement. And so continuing to renew that, consensus that Ukraine basically has with Europe is very important. That's what this meeting is about. Macron and the French government are a very important participant.
And French President Emmanuel Macron will soon travel to China to persuade Chinese authorities to influence Russia to agree to a ceasefire in Ukraine. According to La Tribuna, official Paris aims for the Chinese leadership to somehow shift the Kremlin's position on the ceasefire. What strategic goals might President Macron hope to achieve by engaging China on the issue of a Russia-Ukraine ceasefire?
China remains very important, and Russia relies on China for an alliance that it has for equipment and component parts it needs to continue to build its war machine. And if China were truly on the sidelines, which unfortunately it's not, that would be devastating for Russia. So it's very important that there's outreach like this to China to make it clear to China, which acts in its own interest, that it's more in its interest to support putting pressure on Russia so that there is a peace agreement than it is to side with Russia and prolong this illegal conflict.
And if we're talking about China, let's talk about India, because I see that state-owned Indian refineries, Indian Oil and Bharat Petroleum, are resuming purchases of Russian crude oil at a discount of about $5 per barrel. Bloomberg reports, according to their agency's sources, the purchases were made through new trading entities with payments made in UAE dirhams and US dollars. In such cases, Russia may earn around $40 to $45 per barrel. These purchases confirm a cautious return to Russian oil among some Indian refineries, although overall spot buying remains limited as refiners assess the shift in sanctions landscape.
Well, unfortunately, there are always going to be profiteers who are seeking to make money. And in this case, you can probably make a lot of money if you don't care about U.S. sanctions, you don't care about the ethics and morals of dealing in Russian oil, because you're getting that big discount. And at the volume of oil and gas you can buy from Russia, you can make a significant profit. But this is where enforcement comes in, and it's very important for the U.S. and the Europe, which are maintaining sanctions and continuing to ratchet up those sanctions on the Russian oil sector. They need to enforce those sanctions, and including put in place secondary sanctions as necessary against the companies, banks, and institutions that enable the sale of Russian oil.
And here we have a new message. We mentioned Macron, and now I see that on Wednesday, December 3rd, French President Emmanuel Macron will ask Xi Jinping to influence Russia to achieve a ceasefire in Ukraine during his visit to China, according to a statement by French Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot. Macron will arrive in Beijing on Wednesday and remain there until Friday. This will be his fourth official visit to China during his presidency. During the visit, the French president intends to ask the Chinese leader Xi Jinping to influence Russia. As we said, in this way, Macron aims to secure a ceasefire in Ukraine and to improve trade relations between China and the EU. Barrot emphasized, we are counting on China, which like us is a permanent member of the Security Council, to influence Russia so that Russia, and particularly Vladimir Putin, finally agrees to a ceasefire. So we're waiting. A little bit more about Europe and the United States of America. Bloomberg reports that Europeans are trying to persuade the U.S. not to withdraw troops from Europe. At the end of October, Washington announced that the number of American troops in Romania, which hosts several NATO bases, had been reduced from 1,700 to 1,000. Troop withdrawals are also planned from Bulgaria, Slovakia, and Hungary. And U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth stated that this move was coordinated with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte and allied partners. What message might these troop reductions send to Russia?
Frankly, it sends the wrong message. When Russia is emboldened and threatening the territory, not just of Ukraine, but of some of the NATO countries in Eastern Europe, a big U.S. presence is important to remind Russia that the U.S. takes its Article 5 obligations under the NATO Charter seriously. And so when we want to show force and show power and show that there could be consequences for illegal conduct, we move troops closer to a country. Here, withdrawing those countries, just as Russia is growing as a threat, is a mistake. And so I think the European countries that are complaining about this and trying to urge President Trump to keep the troop presence in Europe should continue to do that. The Romanian bases you mentioned are very important to NATO. Actually, the trend was to increase the troop presence by a number of NATO countries on those bases, and that would be probably the wiser approach given the threat.
David, and also, how could these troop movements impact NATO's ability to respond quickly to potential threats in Eastern Europe?
Well, obviously, it's going to be harder to respond if we have less troops, if we have, less equipment, less fighter jets and air defense systems. So hopefully we're keeping all of the equipment and systems in place. This is a temporary reduction in forces, but that it could be supplemented, especially if the threat grows.
And also, NATO intends to explore the possibility of a preemptive strike against Russia in response to the Kremlin's hybrid warfare. NATO Military Committee Chairman Admiral said how deterrence is achieved through a retaliatory strike, through a preemptive strike, is a question we need to analyze thoroughly, as pressure on this issue may increase in the future. What role does hybrid warfare play in shaping NATO's strategic planning and potential responses? And how might this discussion affect allied countries' defense postures and planning within NATO?
Well, obviously, you have to plan for every contingency, and you have to have, tools and strategies to respond to the situation. So, having plans for a preemptive strike is important. That doesn't mean you should exercise those plans. We need to be careful about not escalating with Russia, but obviously NATO has the capacity to strike Russia, and it should be prepared to do so in case that becomes necessary, but hopefully it will not.
David, thank you so much for this important and interesting conversation, as always. Thanks for supporting Ukraine and Ukrainian people. David Tafuri, international lawyer and former U.S. State Department official, was with us today. Please share this interview and continue your support in Ukraine. See you. Thank you so much.
Дякую, слава Україні!
Героям слава!